how do you know the institution has certain standards? Let's
Mhm.
assume it has standards. And so we have a bunch of students that are going to come in, minority students or students of color, who have not had the opportunity to learn at the high school level, for instance.
Mhm.
And we're going to educate them. And the best example of that actually is City College in New York, because I thought that open enrollment was fine because in Mississippi, where I'm from, you had to do the work or you didn't get out of school. I didn't know that in New York, they just passed people along. So when they started talking about open enrollment in the university system, I said, well, why not? They finished high school.
Mhm.
The institution, City College, dropped because the people in the school, they didn't put the things in place to help those students rise up. So what is the role of the institution in that, in that example? Because New York, by the way, has one of the most segregated school systems in the world, and the people of color didn't stand a chance. So they go to college to get it, and all of a sudden the college is ordering Dick and Jane,
Mhm.
you know. And so, what is the role of the college as you see it?
I see it as the institution has a responsibility to do multiple things. The first one is for students who are entering the institution that are not at the academic standard of a college student, our job is scaffolding and backfilling and getting that student up to the standard they need to be at to be an active, engaged college student. That can mean classes that are developmental in nature, but it can also mean classes that operate in tandem. So rather than having to do all of this developmental work first, you're able to take the college level class with an added component to help you build in and backfill all of that content or experience so that you can be successful. And we've seen a lot of success with that, not only at Weber State University, but at institutions across the country. And it requires that an institution, one, recognize the fact that there are students who need supplemental support or scaffolding. And two, that we actually then become committed to providing that scaffolding in meaningful ways to help the student succeed in ways that the student recognizes as being a part of their overall experience and not as a deficit, because that also undermines the student if they are seen as deficit in their programs. So instead of marketing a class as a developmental class, unless you're talking about developmental psychology or something like that, instead of marketing something as developmental math, you scaffold it as um, a refresh of math basics that will allow you to have a high functioning grasp of the algebraic standards that we require of all students. So it's just in supplement and enhancement of what you're doing. And it's not an expectation that you can't jump through this hoop. It's how do we help you jump through the hoop as successfully as you can, right? Knowing that everybody who jumps through the hoop comes at it with different experiences, skills, and limitations. And so
Okay.
as an institution, there's that component, but then there's another piece, and that piece requires that institutions actually develop relationships with the communities they reside in and the school districts that they serve. And so in a public setting, you know where your catchment area or who the students are that are most likely to come to you. You know which schools they come from. You know, so you can look at the economic backgrounds based on federal financial aid applications. You have a lot of information to work with. It then becomes imperative that as an institution, you become committed to those areas to cultivate a college going environment. Because the first time you go on a college campus, if you've never been on one before, it's intimidating.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. It's a university or college. But if you've been coming to a college environment since you were in elementary school because you went and saw a performing arts event, or you went up for the storytelling festival, or you went to see athletic events with your friends and family, that becomes a place where you belong versus a place where other people belong who aren't like you. And so the institution really has to make a commitment to the community and the region that they serve to not only develop a sense of belonging, but to make sure that people belong once they're there.
Okay.
And then that's the third component is once these students who haven't been in our spaces arrive, or faculty and staff, we have to do everything possible as an institution to make sure that they are welcomed, that they are included, and that this is where they want to be. And that means that we have to be willing to make changes and modifications to ourselves as an institution, because people will point out the things you can't see because you're too used to it, because it's too close to you,
Right.
because you're a part of the structure in the institution. Somebody else from the outside can point out this thing that you haven't seen in the midst of all of this good work and inclusive practice and equity and diversity that you're doing over here. You may have a spot that you simply can't see that somebody else can point out to you. And that change that then needs to happen is not because you're failing, but because you have an opportunity to do better because you now know better.
What do you find is the biggest challenge you have at Weber State? Is it, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, is it the training of, is it helping students of color belong? Or is it dealing with white students? Or is it dealing with white faculty? Where's the biggest disconnect in helping all that?
So the interesting thing is we are at a very different time today, even than 10 years ago in higher ed. And I would say it's less of a single sort of stumbling point or obstacle, and more about these shorter disconnections where people have a sense that, okay, this is what equity means, this is what inclusion and diversity means, and they're going along, and then there's something that makes them feel uncomfortable or that's different than what they've done before. And so there's a disconnect between what I believe and what I do. But that's in all of these arenas. It's not one arena over the other. In fact, for my own institution, what I can tell you is yesterday, I did the second podcast with a group of educators on campus who are doing a series on race and talking about different issues and opportunities in education and how can we address these difficult conversations? How can we get people to be comfortable being uncomfortable so that we can actually do the work and move forward together? And after I finished the podcast with these 3 faculty members, they said, Adrienne, we think this is bigger than just the College of Education. We think this should be university-wide. And I said, it absolutely should be. I'm happy to do whatever I can to help you make it so. But these were also 3 individuals, 2 of whom were men who would, I believe, identify as white, who said, through these conversations, they are now seeing and understanding things that they previously didn't see before or understand. And so at the base level, it's a level of willingness. And there are going to be people who are unwilling to see the world the way that it operates for many of us because it is too uncomfortable, and because then they have to have ownership in their role in making it difficult for people who look like me and Lavon and so many others. But then there are other people who say, I didn't know what I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And I'm probably going to get a lot of things wrong, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to try to see or understand something different than what I've understood before. And then we have folks who are like all in, who have had a deeper understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and they're all in. And sometimes people forget that that an ally gets to decide when and where to show up, but that some of us don't get to choose when and where to show up, because the skin I'm in is the skin I'm in. I'm always going to enter the room with this skin, right? And so I don't get to pick and choose when I'm going to stand up and point out inequality or oppression or racism or any of the other identities that are attached to my skin. But an ally can decide, I'm going to sit this one out. And so it's getting people to move from just being an ally to being an accomplice and saying, I'm going to stand up, even when it might be against my own self-interest, even when it might put me in a negative position, because I have the power and the privilege to stand up in these spaces in ways that other people might not be able to. And so it's these fundamental shifts. And I can't say that for every place, but what I can say is in Utah at the system level, we have a new board of higher education. And one of the things that the system board is doing is actually developing an equity lens. And all of the chief diversity officers across the state are working with them on that equity lens to look at policy and programs and actually the impacts, direct and indirect, that on their face we might not expect or anticipate, and how to work through them and resolve them in advance of a harm that they could do to members of our communities.
This is the state system, right?
This is the state system. And I will add as a side note that Westminster College, which is a private institution, and BYU, also a private institution, both engage in many of those conversations with us regularly. And I actually have a workshop I will be doing with BYU faculty, Brigham Young University faculty, in the next 2 weeks as they prepare to start school, because they are very concerned that they do not fully understand the impact of race relations on their students and their ability to effectively learn and be productive citizens of the world.
I'll give you an example, and then you can tell me, if you ignore it, or if it works, or how it works. So, my daughter is a person of privilege in a lot of ways, and she went to a high school, that the maximum number of students in the class was 14 or 15, and they sat around the Harkness table to do their lessons and to talk. So the school not went out of its way, but worked very hard at bringing in students of color. And so they did it in Harlem, they did it in institutions who recruited the students, they did it in other countries. I went there twice. I went there a lot, but I went there once, and there were a bunch of kids who wore the dress of the ghetto. They had the shirts hanging down, the pants hanging down, and all this. So I told my daughter, I said, "You're not going here if this is what they allow." I'm gonna, it was a class issue. And apparently I was not the only parent that felt that way. So they talked to the people, and they had a rule that says, when you come to the school, you have to dress like our students. Right? Now, a lot of people didn't like that, because they come from the hood, and that's how they dress at home. A lot of the students felt separate from everybody else, because they were among the best and the brightest, and they were invited to be that. The school went out of its way. They took people to plays. They did all kinds of stuff, but they didn't understand the students. They understood what they did, but they didn't understand the students. And many of the students then collected in this little enclave, if you will, and that's who they were. How do you get the students to accept that the institution has accepted them, which they did, but that you have to do something? You have to be a part of. You have to accept that the school, they have courses, they have people that sing, they have people that dance, they have parents that come there to eat. The student has to understand that this is not like it was at home. So how do you deal with that? So, because a lot of them left.
Right. So there's a couple of underlying questions I would have, because it's one thing to bring in performances or to provide a visible example of something. Whether or not that's integrated throughout the curriculum is an entirely different thing. For example, in history, when we talk about American history, Are we getting into the details that are obscured in so many of the texts? Are we talking about the fact that the Southern documents actually said succession is about slavery?
Right.
Right. Are we talking about the fact that when we discuss lynching, that Hispanic people were lynched?
Right.
Like, are we engaging multiple identities into the curriculum versus sort of this sanitized, neutral version of an American history? When we talk about sort of manifest destiny, do we talk about the impacts and harms done to Native populations? Because suddenly what I wear becomes less important because who I am and where I came from are a part of the curriculum and discussion. And it's not just a performance here where I get to see someone, it's part of the actual everyday learning experience. So there's that component. The second component is making sure that students have a way to celebrate who they are without it creating
Us and them.
well, right. But how do we make sure that students get to celebrate themselves without it distracting from the learning of the overall group? So then you get into conversations about, okay, if we have a uniform costs X amount of dollars, can everybody afford to pay for it? What does that look like? Because, you know, we go to uniforms because it can sometimes neutralize economic difference, right? Except for if we all have to wear a blue polo, the polo I get at my Walmart superstore is not the same as the polo that's Ralph Lauren.
Right.
They're both blue, they're both a polo, but everybody knows what this polo means versus this polo over here.
Gotcha.
It's figuring out how do we find ways to balance and create equity so that the learning that happens is valuable, because it doesn't just inform our underserved or underrepresented students. This fundamentally transforms how white students learn as well, and how they operate in the world, how they exercise their power and privilege in the world to actually be the citizens, the global citizens that I think we seek to develop.
Here's a very white question. All right. Look, you got black schools. You got Howard, you got Tougaloo, you've got all these places. Why can't there be a white school? And why does that have to be diversified? But yet you've got, you know, a black school, which is fine to be black. Not that they don't have some white students there, but the percentage of people of color at traditionally white school is much greater than the number of percentage of white people at a black school. So, I mean, who's really being discriminatory at this point?
Well, one, I would ask you, why do you think that white students aren't going to these institutions that are historically Black or Hispanic or tribal colleges?
Mm-hmm.
I would ask you, do they not see themselves there? Do they worry that their identities would be marginalized? And then ask yourself the reverse. So for our predominantly large institutions that are white, do our students of color not see themselves there? Do they think that if they were in those spaces, they would be oppressed, that their identities would be used against them? Let's have that conversation. It's not a one-way street. Then second, I would ask you to consider, is the world that we operate in one where we can easily segregate ourselves? It can happen. It's not impossible, but it's getting much harder in our global society where somebody is listening or watching this podcast. The two of us are in Utah. Luvan is back east. Whoever's watching could be in Germany. They could be in Brazil. And what that means is the world is smaller than ever before. So our need to understand, to be able to engage with and work with people who look different than we do, who have different belief systems, who have different value systems from us, is even more critical now than ever before. Finally, when you look at these institutions that are historically Black or Hispanic or tribal colleges, these institutions were actually created or supported by the American government as places for students to go who fit those demographics so that they wouldn't be in these other institutions that are normal, accepted institutions. So they were fundamentally created for a particular type of person, maybe somebody who looks like me. So can other people attend historically Black college or university? Absolutely. Loki, your mom is the perfect example of someone doing just that, and doing that in a time when it was unthinkable, right? And yet she did it anyway, in pursuit of knowledge, in pursuit of relationships, in pursuit of challenging the norm of what was and was not acceptable. So yes, diversity is still absolutely necessary. If we just want to make a business case for diversity, for example, we know that corporations that have diverse teams, diverse leadership, perform better because the problem solving may be different. The ideas and experiences are different. So the solutions that are brought to the table are different. We don't live in a one-size-fits-all world anymore. And when you factor that in, suddenly markets change, perspectives change, needs change, ways of reaching each other changes. And unless you have the diversity, you're never going to be able to do it.
There's but there are two things that are happening. There are historically Black colleges that are still that pretty much Black colleges, but there are a bunch of them that aren't.
Right, that have the designation, but that have predominantly white student bodies.
Exactly, because a lot of them would have closed without it, first of all. And secondly, the white students have discovered that, wait a minute, I can afford this, and I get a pretty good education here.
Not a pretty good education, an excellent education.
Right. So there's a lot happening with those colleges because of economics. And there's a lot happening. The more people that discover they got a good education for a lot less money, they go there.
Right.
And so that's the first thing that happened. The other thing that's going on is, if you look in, I'll use business. A lot of Black people now have money. A lot of people of color now have money. So you look at the banks, the investment institutions, and places like that, they're hiring a lot of people of color. Why? Because when you sit across the table, you want to talk to somebody that looks like you. So there's a lot going on underneath, despite Clarence Thomas. There's a lot going on about people being, people who are Black or people who are brown, becoming a part of. And what we're talking about today is, well, how do we make sure we have more of those? And how do we get them to be, why is it such a struggle to become that?
Well, I mean, one of the things we saw with affirmative action, like when California did away with it, the number of students of color dropped off a cliff. What happened?
What happened was students heard that they were not welcome at those institutions, that they were not seen as coming with value, as having a funds of knowledge to contribute. So why even apply? Why go to the place that you already know is going to be a battle every day of your life? And that's painful to me, because we make these decisions and these struggles around, who do we encourage to go to college, period? Who do we send to tech colleges or junior colleges or community colleges? And what are our expectations? I am a fan of our community college system. Weber State serves as the community college for Northern Utah. But I also realize that when we look at the enrollment rates, Black and brown men enroll in community colleges far more frequently than in colleges and universities.
Yeah.
And they also graduate at the lowest rates from community colleges.
Wow.
So what does that mean? That we send people to a place where they're less likely to succeed? Or do we figure out, hey, you are interested in college, you're college ready. Here is a good opportunity for you. And starting at the community college may be the right place, but it also could be going to the university. And when I think about our tech colleges are critical to the workforce. But as advisors, we don't get to pick students and say, well, this group of students should be tracked that way. This is the future that they can have. we should support anyone who wants to have a technical education to go to a tech college and potentially leverage their degree or certificate as a stackable credential to complete higher education elsewhere. But we shouldn't go in with the mindset that this particular group of students, they just can go to technical college. One, it undervalues what a technical college does. And two, it undervalues who an individual is and what they can do. And I think that that's where a lot of the churn that we see is happening. And people don't see that as bias. They see that as benevolence, as providing an opportunity. And really it's tracking people. And I am troubled by that, as troubled by it as I was when I was a student here in Utah in high school.
Yeah.
That students get tracked in ways that are inconsistent with their interests or their abilities, but simply by virtue of the color of their skin or their language or other heritage aspects.
My friend Lou runs an organization, and he gets a lot of people in colleges and stuff. The problem is that the student then has to go back home. We had one student, he did. So the guy made this, he was a senior in college. He was about to graduate. He stole something.
Mm.
Now, the day they go into this college, they give them a computer. So he didn't have to steal it.
Right.
They give it to them. But he stole one. And finally, we found out that the reason he stole it was because what was happening back at home, that he was not a part of his community.
Mm.
And he knew that if they caught him stealing, they would kick him out. So he got kicked out of, well, he didn't, but we saved him. But the bottom line was he felt he didn't belong. He didn't belong back home. So he was afraid to give all that up to move forward.
Mm.
And there are a lot of students like that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about, these students who come from different neighborhoods and such communities, they go back and then they're judged. Well, you're not one of us anymore because you went to college.
Yeah.
I instantly go back and think about Michael Jackson's Bad video. Sure enough, in the Bad video, he comes back. So you're not down with it. You ain't bad. You ain't nothing. You ain't nothing. Right. So Michael Jackson wasn't lying.
Nope.
Yeah. All right.
But the ones who make it, they do well.
This is an issue that colleges and universities have all over the country, with students who enroll, come to campus and maybe don't see themselves represented in ways that have high value. And so then they're getting involved in this culture that's different than where they've been at in their home life. They go home and visit, and then families may say, you think you're better than we are? Are you giving up our culture, our language, our traditions and customs? And so helping students navigate that is critical to overall student success, one. But two, that requires that institutions do something about parent programs and family programs to help them understand what it means for their student to be in these spaces and what possibilities and opportunities it opens up for other members of the family and the community at large. And so an example I would give is I had a student when I taught back east. I had two students actually who were Hispanic women, and they lived at home, and their families didn't understand why they were doing homework when they came home. They wanted them to be working in the family business and engaging in traditions that were a part of their family. And they said, you go to school during the day and then you come home at night and you want to do more school, but we need you to work in our bodega, or we need you to help take care of grandma or a younger sibling. And this is taking up too much of your time. But it was because the family didn't understand that for every hour of class time a student has, there's approximately 3 hours of study time that goes with it. So let's say you're taking 12 credits. You've really got about 36 hours worth of study.
Right.
It's a full-time job. But if you don't have a sense of understanding about how that translates, You would think they don't care about our family, they're dropping our culture and traditions, like all of these things. So then another example is we know for students who are Hispanic or Latinx identified, their rates of success increase dramatically when the work that they do directly impacts the home community.
Hmm.
Whether that's doing undergraduate research into issues in their community or opportunities for program development or resource development, whatever it is, if there is that connection to the home, those student success rates go through the roof.
Right.
Because then there's not this fear of losing your identity.
Right. Right.
And that's why programs like ethnic studies are so powerful and why people are so afraid of them.
Mm.
Suddenly, if you identify and know your culture and your heritage and your traditions and what they mean in relation to the larger society, then you may not be as inclined to participate in the status quo.
Right. But the interesting thing then becomes is that as you have those courses, as you have those events and so forth, suddenly the greater white populace of the campus is like, oh, well, oh gosh, well, there they go again, you know, trying to force this upon us. It's like, well, maybe it's just for them and not for you, which is okay. But there's that sense of not being one of us.
Well, and I love that you brought that up because for years I led the Center for Diversity and Unity at Weber State University. And I would have students who identified as white who would say to me, oh, well, that's so cool. You guys do really cool programs, but that space is not for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, why do you think the space is not? Well, I'm not diverse. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about your family background and heritage and da 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 da. Well, you know, maybe my family, if you trace my generations back, we're Irish or we're German or whatever. Okay, so that's a culture. That's a heritage. There's language, there's reasons to celebrate, there are reasons to recognize what's happened in history. You have a heritage too, but you've given it up because you just said you are the neutral default of white. We can celebrate those aspects of your identity too without it harming or negatively impacting someone else. No one is trying to say anyone's better than anyone else. We're simply trying to recognize and honor the traditions and cultures that people come from.
So whose responsibility is it, for instance, to show that my showing my heritage or my experience in my heritage is important to the larger population? Because if it's not important to the larger population, I don't care. And that's what you get is okay, so they do that. But I don't care because it's not important to me. Now, I believe it is, but there needs to be a willingness to show that. So how does the institution foster that willingness?
One of the first ways, and it's very hard, is to help people understand that what we're talking about when we honor heritage is not superiority.
Right.
But many of our students who identify as white, even with specific cultural heritage, worry that celebrating that in some way implies supremacy. And so helping students understand you can be explicit and that's not what you're doing. You're celebrating the food, the culture, the religion, the tradition, the clothes, whatever it is. But you're not doing that to say that this is better than anyone else. Simply, this is who we are and how we operate as a culture.
Right.
And that's not the same thing as saying whiteness trumps everything.
Right.
Right.
But the institution has to be willing to help engage those conversations and facilitate those discussions and to create those spaces for people to be able to celebrate their identity without it being a supremacy issue.
So the institution is responsible for, let's say that you have the Spanish girls or whoever who worked in the bodega. Puerto Ricans typically go with bodega, so I'm going to just say that. How do they show that they're being able to do that or their history is important to everybody else? In other words, it's not just you select the Stoke group. So how do I show that what I'm doing is important to everybody, not just me? I'm celebrating it because that's who I am, but I'm not going off in a corner and doing that. I'm including you. I'm telling you to come on in because we're all going to do this today. That's the institution or that's the people?
It's both. It's the institution and the people. And in that way, it's important to you to understand, because then you can begin to think about where I'm coming from, where my perspective is, why I might engage in something this way instead of that way. You can then have respect for me as a person, as someone with a common humanity. Otherwise, what happens is we minimalize people, and we marginalize people, and we oppress people until we turn them not into people. So it's okay how we treat them because they're not like us. And that's what the fundamental piece is it helps us develop respect and understanding of each other. Now, we don't have to, if I do ballet folklorico, I can attend a performance or I can support my student club or whatever. That doesn't mean I have to go out and learn how to do it, but maybe I do because I want to understand and be a part of this thing that brings people such joy that I'm seeing in performances.
I remember when I visited Russia when I was in high school, and my frustration was that we had translators, and so I could never actually talk to the people directly. So when I went back, that was between my junior and senior year. So I graduated high school, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to go back and talk to those people, but I'm going to talk to them in their language. Because I don't want anything missed in the translation. And so I went to school for 3 years. Then, during the summer, I went, studied Russian, went to Russia, went to Moscow State University and studied Russian there and spoke with the same people I had met 4 years earlier, just to be able to talk with them again. That doesn't mean my Russian was great. But, nonetheless, it was just trying to bridge that gap to understand. And then, mind you, this is this is going on. Perestroika is happening and so forth, and glasnost. But growing up under the Red Scare and stuff, and the commies are going to bomb us. Better dead than red, that type of stuff. Having that ingrained with Red Dawn and these Chuck Norris movies and so forth. That going over that was the enemy, right? That's us versus them, on a global scale. But I found that just being able to not asking them to learn English, but asking myself to learn Russian made all the difference in breaking that down.
And what a privilege that you had the ability to learn Russian and then go live with Russian people.
There was something that was said earlier, and I want to kind of jump back to this because I thought it was really fascinating. This was about families who are, students who are going back and their families don't have a culture of going to college. Right? Which for me sounds very bizarre. I mean, growing up, my grandmother, the classic story. She went to night school for 20 years so she could, blah, blah, blah. My mom, of course, went to college. My dad went to college. So it was ingrained in us, you're going to college. It wasn't even a question. My peers around me, that was just kind of a given. It's because all my brothers went as well. Is part of that because the institutions, historically these institutions were white, so white people had it ingrained in them. That's what you do is you go to college and then you get the degree and go to the schools. And because of that exclusion, it was like, there's not even a hope of even getting that education. So what happened?
What happened was World War II and the GI Bill, because all white people were not going to colleges either, unless you had family money, more or less. So there's that component, which is really critical. To generational wealth with home buying after World War II. So families had actual resources to purchase homes and then to spend money to help pay to go to college. 3, the cost of colleges and universities, access to institutions. We had to integrate our university system. And maybe you weren't close to a historically Black or Hispanic or tribal college. So you had to think about regions. There's a plethora of reasons that go into this, but another piece is this notion that you don't have a college going culture and you're deficit because of that, it's highly problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing that people say is, well, they just don't care about education. And that's a luxury to say that, because I'm sure that people care about education, but sometimes you're focused on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you've got to make sure you have a place to live, that you are safe, that there is food, and sometimes those trump things like education.
Right.
So the question then becomes, what are we doing to make sure that education is not only accessible, but it's affordable, and it will not actually put the family back because somebody's going to school? Because I don't think that people or cultures don't care about education. In fact, I would say the contrary. And we can see it because of cultural tradition and history being passed down, either orally or through writings and documentation. But I would say sometimes in life, there are other conflicting values or needs that come into play that make education not possible, as well as the experiences that people have had in their own educational journey that determine whether or not this is something that you want to put your own children or family members through.
If you look back at history, when there were plenty of jobs in the factories in Detroit, in Chicago, the parents went to work, but the kids went to school.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because they had the money. To your point, they could do that. It is recently that kids don't see a need to go to college, or parents don't. But certainly for Black people, education, I can only talk to Southerners because I grew up there, but education was important. Neither one of my parents went to school. Well, they went. My mother went to the ninth grade. My old man went to wherever he went. It was important that I brought home grades, that they looked good. The teachers had all the power. So education was extremely important because that was the only way to get ahead.
Right.
And the way they fed that was through these factories. When those jobs dried up is when you started seeing problems. Back to what Adrian was saying, was that they didn't have the money.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look back in history, it's always been important because that was how we got ahead. It was education.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And you have to think about things in the greater context. When we teach Brown versus Board of Education, we teach a very sanitized version of integration and busing, and then everybody had equity in education and it was wonderful. Well, that's not reality. That's
Right.
not the way it was. We saw, especially in the South, hundreds of Black schools, or schools that had served as education sites for Black children, closed down, and no replacement for them. We literally have a generation in the South where there wasn't an opportunity for education because the schools didn't exist because of Brown versus the board. And that's part of the story that doesn't get told, right?
And then the economic resources are pulled. So obviously there's the white flight into the academies in the South, but like in Selma,
Right.
for example, once integration hit, and particularly, when the right to vote came, the white residents literally formed another town and took their money with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that tax base that funds schools. And you see that even today, where there are white neighborhoods that are going, we're going to form our own school system. And
we're going to form charter schools. And this is not being against charter schools, because
Right.
I think there's some wonderful charter schools that exist. But looking at whether or not federal dollars go to charter schools, is that another way to fund segregated education? I kind of think yes, because that's what we're seeing, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't have some really great charter schools that exist. There's one that's right down the street from me that focuses on business and entrepreneurship from K through 9. And it's something that we'll have to think about for our son. Do we send him there? Do we send him to the local elementary school? Do we go for a private? But even having the capacity to have those choices, you have to think differently about what it means to say education is accessible to all. Because while you may have access to an education, it's not the same education.
Yeah.
Because one school may have technology and another school might not. So when you graduate from high school and go to college, this expectation for you to be digitally fluent isn't reality because of the environment you come out of. Well, and exactly, and this is an issue that we're really seeing in our rural communities, because if there is internet, it may be at the lowest speeds available. And the systems may be overwhelmed because of the number of people in the rural community trying to access it at the same time, which creates different types of digital divides. And if we're looking at rural areas in heavily populated Black states, that's even more damaging. So when we talk about equity and access and education, we really have to be specific about what we mean and how we explore it and make sure that there's actual equity. Because sometimes it's the easiest just to say, well, everybody can go to school. If people choose not to go, if they choose to skip class or whatever, that's on them. What are the interventions in place that can help a student gain those educational opportunities and address whatever it is that could make them skip school? Is it that they're picked on by their peers? Is it that they're picked on by their teachers? Is it that their clothes aren't clean? We're seeing schools that have laundries in them because we know that kids miss school when their clothes aren't clean. And your clothes not being clean doesn't mean your parents don't care about you. It may mean the difference between we had money for food or we had money for laundry detergent.
All right, listen, I know you guys want to talk more, and this is all wonderful, but I gotta go eat.
So Levon is shutting this down. He had his nap. He's got to go straight from nap to food and back to a nap, right?
Well, I've been on this for almost 2 hours, so
Yeah, I feel you.
I'm not putting everybody down. I'm just saying,
You know what I'm saying?
I have to go.
I understand.
You guys can keep talking. No, this is great though.
Well, I'll jump right into it. Well, hey, Levon, you go eat. Enjoy. And Adrian, we thank you so much for joining us and stuff. And yeah, we're gonna have to do some more of this.
I would be delighted. You two are fantastic to see in person, but since I don't get to see very many people in person anymore, seeing you both via Zoom is a gift, and you have made my Saturday morning.
Oh, wonderful. Right. Enjoy the puppy and the baby.
We'll send a note that says you had the W displayed and in the background, so it was okay. You did the right amount of advertising.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I would be happy to talk to you guys anytime.
Oh, right, beautiful, beautiful. You look good.
Oh, well, thank you.
We'll get you again.
Okay, I would be delighted.
All right, take care.
Take care, y'all. Thank you much.
Bye, Loki. Take care, bud.